My name is Dr. Davita Lindsay Harewood, and I'm so glad you're here with me today as we look at the Amistad Mandate. We will be looking at the Amistad Mandate and going beyond February. I'm so glad that all of you are here today as we continue our work on educating and investing in our future. I invite all participants to set their minds in neutral. Let's not focus on what was to be done or what is waiting ahead. Let's commit to be present and stay in a growth mindset. This presentation is entitled Beyond February because the New Jersey Amistad Mandate requires us to move the teaching of Africans and African Americans beyond the month of February, Black History Month. The ignorance of each other's backgrounds, etc., is really at the base of the problem. So, education will resolve this, I believe. William Payne. William Payne is one of the sponsors of the 2002 New Jersey Amistad Bill. This first quote comes from Assemblyman Payne. In 2002, the Amistad Bill became law in the state of New Jersey. Its focus is on the teaching of social studies. Elizabeth Public Schools is committed to its full infusion. New Jersey schools are to incorporate African American history into their social studies curriculum. The law established the Amistad Commission to ensure African American history, contributions, and experiences are in the state's classroom. This month, our governor reaffirmed New Jersey's commitment to the 2002 law. There is discussion of expanding the Amistad law into other areas of instruction, such as science and math, and more information will be coming from the state. Many districts are awaiting next steps, but not Elizabeth Public Schools. Elizabeth Public Schools has continued to move forward by investing resources in this important education and social studies mandate. Why the Amistad legislation matters? Quite simply, African American history is American history. Let me say that again. African American history is American history. Relegating Africans and African Americans to the margins of history limits and distorts our students' education and their understanding of themselves and their society. The Amistad legislative mandate seeks to redress these distortions and omissions to ensure educational excellence that accompanies an inclusive curriculum. The need for all students and Americans to obtain a more inclusive education becomes more evident daily. A Pew Research study found that Americans say they've been paying more and more attention to issues of race. Our students are also paying more attention. Our purpose here today is to update educators on Elizabeth Public Schools' progress in implementing the Amistad law, address changing expectations from the stakeholders, including students, teachers, the community, as well as the Amistad Collaborative, and also to identify strategies to support teachers and students. In December of 2019, I conducted a study to evaluate Elizabeth Public School District's revised curricula in language arts and social studies to determine if the history, experiences, and contributions of African Americans had been included. I reported to the Board of Education and now report to you that the Elizabeth Public School District has invested resources to meet the requirements of the New Jersey Amistad legislative mandate. There is abundant evidence of the Amistad legislative mandate across the board in 31 social studies and language arts courses analyzed. K-12 public school students will learn information related to the history of Africans and African Americans in the United States, highlighting sacrifices, contributions, and achievements. The 7th grade social studies curriculum stands out as an exemplar and is a model for other courses. Use of a similar model will enable students to see the tapestry of history as inclusive of Africans and African Americans. Findings, kindergarten through grade 8. Elizabeth Public School District students have the greatest exposure to Africans and African Americans in their social studies instruction. Kindergarten through grade 6 students view images and read about Africans and African Americans in both nonfiction and historical fiction materials. Topics include African folktales, the transatlantic slave trade, enslavement in the South, the Underground Railroad, and the Civil War. The 7th grade social studies course is an exemplar. Using themes, tools, and resources, Africans and African Americans are placed at the center of the nation's history from colonization through Reconstruction. Units include the courage to overcome obstacles, walk a mile in my shoes, conformity and rebellion, and transformation. Findings, high school social studies. Elizabeth Public School students in social studies general courses, world history, US history 1 and 2, have greater exposure to Africans and African Americans in their curriculum than students who take advanced placement level courses. Africans and the African diaspora in world history leads to US 1 and US 2 that both have examples of Africans and the African Americans in the creation and growth of the nation. US History 1, however, was found to be in need of improvement. An inclusive theme of Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans converging to settle colonial America is not present. Africans were removed from the center of the national landscape and mentioned only in the context of enslavement and its negative consequences on establishing a new nation. This is the opposite of the Amistad legislative mandate. Changing expectations of stakeholders. Elizabeth Public School District leadership has committed to increase implementation of the Amistad legislative mandate within social studies courses. Discussions continue on expanding the mandate to other curricular areas. School leaders ensure all students learn an inclusive history. Teachers need resources and support. Students want to see themselves and neighbors incorporated in their learning. The community expect educators to implement the law. Community feedback tells us that when implementing the law effectively, all students come to know that the American experience is inclusive of the African American experience. Community feedback. This slide shows quotes from what people are saying about what they're learning. Cherry Hill 7th grader learned virtually the same lesson her mother learned 20 years ago at the same school. The whole issue with racism is that kids aren't taught to humanize other people who aren't like them, said Bianca Garcia, who attended school in Wayne, New Jersey, and launched a petition on change.org. The only thing we hear about African American history is slavery and the civil rights movement. We existed before slavery, said high school students who are demanding schools teach more Black history, including Black authors. Recently, Cherry Hill School District became the first school district in New Jersey to mandate the teaching of African American history in order to complete graduation requirements. The Cherry Hills curriculum director said, "There is no history without Black history." The purpose of the Amistad Collaborative is to ensure Elizabeth Public Schools achieves the learning goals set forth by the New Jersey legislature in the Amistad Bill. The instruction must also emphasize the personal responsibility of each citizen to fight racism and hatred, and to uphold the national ideals of freedom and justice. The Amistad Collaborative is made up of community and district leaders. The collaborative was created after a group of concerned Elizabeth residents approached the district. They, like many New Jerseyans, were interested in the implementation of the Amistad Law and wanted to work with the Elizabeth Public Schools. For over 1.5 years, they have worked with Elizabeth Public Schools to implement the law. The work of the collaborative has been positive and rewarding. Their work is representative of a true school and community partnership. Self-assessment. Think about it. Think about what and how you learned about Africans and African Americans in our American story. Assess your comfort level on talking about race in the classroom and with fellow educators. Let me tell you my story. What I learned growing up in Cranston, Rhode Island, was slavery was in the South, and I learned about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. What I did not learn was that Rhode Island, like New Jersey, was a slave port. I did not learn about the free communities of African American people in Providence, Nantucket, and Newport, nor the African American men who fought in the American Revolution as the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. I did not learn of the African American businesses or churches that operated in segregated sections, nor the way African Americans in the Great Migration, like my parents, who went to Rhode Island and other northern cities to work in wartime industries. What about that in every war fought for and in this country, African Americans have fought and died? I did not learn that our history is inclusive. I did not see myself in our great history. Think about your experiences. Did you see yourself reflected in the textbooks and the lessons? Many New Jersey students do not. Strategies to support teachers and students. First, let's recognize this is a change for many teachers and students. The Amistad legislative mandate is a change for many teachers and students. Many are learning new material. Let's operate in a growth mindset. Some will be uncomfortable. Elizabeth Public Schools is committed to following the law. Community members are watching and expect to see evidence of the Amistad mandate. Expanded curriculum resources will include 30 Amistad-infused lessons created by Elizabeth Public School educators. I'd like to recognize the group of Elizabeth educators who worked with me to create examples of lessons to increase the Amistad mandate and enhance the existing curriculum. In addition, K-12 lessons provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, which expand the Amistad mandate, are available. The lessons focus on the harm caused by racism and provide a framework for students to understand the historical context of racism. Dr. Lyle Mosley was part of our team. He sourced the work of the New Jersey State Bar Foundation. This work expands the resources and concepts of the Amistad Law. Entitled Breaking Bias, Lessons from the Amistad, these lessons include discussions of racial, gender, and other biases that often get in the way of treating all people equally and limit our ability to welcome and appreciate all people in the American experience. Additional resources include community-provided dramatic presentations provided by United Youth of New Jersey, as well as ongoing professional development. One goal is to bring to life forgotten history using dramatic community presentations. Look for additional lessons and pre-work for students to get the most out of these educational resources.
Hello, my name is Kurtai Dunmore, and welcome to a closer look at grades 3 through 5 lessons created by Kelly S. Collins as part of our Elizabeth Public Schools curriculum writing team. Amistad curriculum teaching. What does it look like? Teaching, the profession that creates all other professions. 3rd through 5th grade teachers will teach African and African American experiences in social studies and language arts throughout the school year. How is it done? Teachers use Elizabeth Public School teacher-created and Amistad-infused lessons. Teachers increase content knowledge of the African and African American experience. Teachers create their own lessons based on modeled lessons and expanding content knowledge. Kelly S. Collins created 9 Amistad-infused lessons for students in grades 3 through 5. Students will be introduced to African Americans in the fields of literature, technology, education, sports, and the arts. In some of the lessons, students will meet Marie Van Britten Brown, nurse and inventor, Wilma Rudolph, Olympic champion, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, reformer, Jan Matzelinger, inventor, the community of Greenwood, Althea Gibson, trailblazer. Now let's take a quick look at an overview of 2 of the lessons created. In this lesson, students will learn about one of Elizabeth's own, Mabel G. Holmes, a former Elizabethan dedicated African American teacher and principal. Many students attend Mabel G. Holmes School, number 5. Do they know it is named for a former Elizabeth teacher and principal who demonstrated to her students what it meant to be a model citizen in school and in the community? This lesson will focus on the civic responsibilities of all Americans and how individuals' actions and interactions affect others in our schools, community, and our country. As an activity, students will create an I Pledge Miss Mabel Holmes book in her honor. This activity can be done electronically or on paper. The short book will showcase the students' pledges to be good citizens in the classroom, community, and country. Now, let's take a look at a lesson that focuses on one of New Jersey's own, Paul Robeson, scholar, athlete, actor, singer, and global activists. In this lesson, students will read and analyze an informational text about Paul Robeson. After reading, students will discuss the information in the text covering such topics as tolerance, acceptance, diversity, overcoming obstacles, termination, and equality. Then, students will write a letter that explains what they can do as individuals to fight against racism and discrimination. Here are some examples of ways to extend student learning using the Amistad-infused lessons. All of these activities can be accomplished in person and virtually. They also provide assessment opportunities. Having students design a Good Citizen Award incorporates art, reading, and writing. The activities that include Keene and Rutgers universities plant seeds for higher education while extending the learning with map creation and research. Within classrooms, there are many opportunities and ways to include African and African American experiences. These experiences are part of our history, American history. Let's continue to educate the students so that they know that our country's history is inclusive of the African and African American experience as we expand the American story. Our goal in Elizabeth Public Schools is for students to know that our history is complex and inclusive. Thank you.
Continuing with strategies to support teachers and students, do contact the teacher creators of the lessons. Do use the lessons they created. Do insert African Americans back into existing lessons. Do create additional lessons with African Americans included. Do support and coach fellow teachers who may seem resistant or unsure. Do assess your lessons. How often do you infuse the Amistad mandate in your lessons? Caution: avoid demonstrations and role plays. Simulation of traumatic experiences is not shown to be effective as a learning strategy and can harm vulnerable students. Let's avoid pedagogy poorly suited to the topic when teaching about enslavement. Demonstrations and role plays are to be avoided. They can be hurtful, even when done with the best intentions in mind. We don't want to recreate hate-based power dynamics. These types of activities can cause emotional trauma and distort students' understanding of history. The most well-meaning lesson can become traumatic for some students. Let's avoid lessons that ask students to reenact being on the Underground Railroad or estimate how many enslaved people they could purchase if they had $1,000. Similar lessons have been taught and have often landed the most well-meaning educators in the media trying to explain the lesson's goals. Again, let's avoid demonstrations and role plays and use other strategies, such as incorporating primary and secondary sources that demonstrate the diversity of our American history. We do want to teach with primary and secondary resources that focus on agency and resistance. Let's emphasize social and emotional dimensions of history. One goal is to help students connect the dots in our history and encourage personal responsibility. At all grade levels, let's make intentional connections. An accurate teaching of history will include good and bad connections to the present. At the lower levels, teachers are encouraged to teach the lasting contributions of African cultures and ideas and the struggle for freedom. At the upper grades, let's teach the lasting contributions of African cultures and ideas and the struggle for freedom. Let's teach the experiences of African American women and the African Americans in the LGBTQ population. Let's teach the enduring impact of racial oppression on contemporary American life. At all grades, we want students to draw conclusions and make sense out of our shared history. Let's take a look at our textbooks. Textbooks tend to center on the white experience from colonization and enslavement through American wars and expansion into modern history. Often, the varied lived experience of African American people is neglected. Too often, educators follow textbook publishers. The goal of the Amistad legislation is to add African Americans back into our classrooms and our diverse and shared history. James Baldwin, a noted writer, said, "History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history." Teaching about slavery and the African American experience is hard. Let me restate that. Teaching about slavery and the African American experience is hard. It requires difficult conversations about race and the American experience. It requires rethinking much of our learning related to the founding fathers, our legal system, ourselves, and our students. It requires learning the diverse African American experience beyond enslavement. It is foundational, however, to learning about racial differences that too often divide our nation. Now is the time to change the way we teach and learn about the African American experience. Terminology. Words have power. Teachers were asked about the language they use when they talk about slavery in the classroom. 73% of teachers use the term slaves rather than enslaved persons. Enslaved persons emphasizes the humanity of enslaved people. Enslaved persons demonstrates agency, recognizing the capacity of individuals to act independently and make choices. 64% of teachers used owners rather than enslavers of people. For some, this is a subtle sanitization of enslavement and its role in white supremacy. This terminology is increasingly used in contemporary scholarship in the field, but has not yet trickled down to K-12 classrooms. The terms enslaved persons or enslaved people, the term enslaver versus owner, these terms have power. Just as we no longer use the term girl to refer to adult women, we must recognize that words have power and continue to use our words effectively. While most are not seeking to embrace white supremacy, words have power and can continue negative past practices and thoughts. For example, thinking of Thomas Jefferson as an enslaver of people challenges the often false narrative of the man who championed liberty and justice at the writing of the Declaration of Independence and its statement about the self-evidence of all men being created equal. More than 500,000 African Americans, most of them enslaved, were living in the 13 colonies. Words have power. There are resources available. Let's explore some of the other resources to professionally implement the Amistad legislative mandate in each classroom. The New Jersey Amistad Commission has interactive curriculum available with lessons that are readily available for teachers from the primary grades through the secondary grades. Earlier, I mentioned Breaking Bias lessons from the Amistad, produced by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, as well as lessons from Learning for Justice. These are just a few examples of the many resources to increase student learning. Lessons for Justice was formerly known as Teaching Tolerance. These resources have been used and are being used by teachers to increase student learning and to ensure we meet the Amistad mandate in New Jersey classrooms. In a few moments, you are going to hear a segment of a TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie. In her presentation of her work, The Danger of a Single Story, she tells us that our lives, our cultures are composed of many overlapping stories, and warns that if we hear only a single story about another person or country, we risk a critical misunderstanding. The danger of a single story.
But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar.
The noted theologian Desmond Tutu said the following: inclusive, good quality education is a foundation for a dynamic and equitable societies. Inclusive, good quality education is a foundation for dynamic and equitable societies. And note, when educators place Africans and African Americans seamlessly into the teaching of social studies and language arts courses, students will see the influence and challenges of this group of Americans. We will emerge from past practices of casting large groups into minor roles while presenting history as a story that presents only the dominant group's achievements. In New Jersey, students will know that our history is complex and inclusive. In Elizabeth, we are preparing students to live in a complex and inclusive society. Teachers, do you feel passionate about creating interesting lessons? Do you want to share knowledge of African American history? Amistad curriculum writers are needed this summer. Contact Bruce Elfline, Social Studies Supervisor, for more information. I look forward to working with all excited teachers. Contact me with your questions, comments, or thoughts via email. I am available to discuss your thoughts, your questions, and your comments on how to educate students so they know that our country's history is inclusive of African and African American experiences. I can be reached by email at dlhenterprisesusa@gmail.com. That's dlhenterprisesusa@gmail.com. Thank you for investing time in increasing your knowledge of New Jersey's Amistad mandate and Elizabeth Public Schools' commitment to teaching an inclusive and diverse American story.